morning. Welcome to UUCC, the UU Church of Canandaigua. I'm Eileen, I'm your minister, and I'm so glad to be with you this morning. As we begin our service, I have just a few quick announcements to share this morning. And I'm going to share my screen to make it easier for you to see what we're talking about. The first are several announcements. These are some dates to keep in mind in the month of June, some dates to remember. First, June 13th is going to be our annual congregational meeting. It'll take place right after the service on June 13th. So if you come to church, you can just stick around in the main Zoom room and we will have our annual congregational meeting. If you can't make it to church, but you're able to make it to the meeting, that's great. It'll start around 11 a.m. And this is where we vote on our budget for the upcoming year. We vote in new members to our board. We decide how our church is going to function in the coming year. So if you're a member, we'd love to have you there and have your vote be part of our decision making. On June 20th, tentatively, hopefully, we are planning for a drive-in flower ceremony service. Weather permitting, viral loads permitting, we think we can probably pull off a drive-in service in our parking lot, a mostly musical service. You might remember the one we did last summer and it was tons of fun. So stay tuned for updates on June 20th. Even if we do the service in person, we're going to stream it to YouTube live. So if you're not able to come in person or don't feel comfortable, you'll be able to catch it on YouTube. And then finally, the last Sunday in June, June 27th, we are going to join Unitarian Universalists around the country at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly, which is all virtual, at their worship at noon, because our West Coast UU siblings don't need to get up at 6 a.m. for church. So our service on the 27th will have a different link. You'll click on that link and go to join UUs all around the country and in Canada to worship together at noon. And then one more thing, if you didn't already know, there is a board meeting today, a church board meeting. If you would like to go, but you don't have the link, you can message Laura Wink or Scarlett in the chat and we'll get you that link right away. If you just message, if you can't find them in the participants, you just message broadly in the chat, we'll make sure to get you the link. And with that, let's take a deep breath in and let us enter a space of worship together. Let's light our chalices together. So grab your home chalice or any old candle, and we'll recite our chalice lighting words. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. So I'm a knitter, and I started knitting a sweater in January. And I realized I had messed up the pattern just right below the collar pretty early on. But I sort of fudged my way back to the correct pattern. If you're a knitter, you'll maybe have this shared experience, and got the right number of stitches again and kept knitting. And as the yoke of the sweater got longer, it became more and more obvious how bad that mess up really was. I kept knitting though, now in full denial. I knew what I needed to do, but I really didn't want to start over. Finally, I set the project in my basket of other unfinished projects, and I walked away from it for a couple of months. It's still right there, still intact. I will have to rip out and unravel all the work I had done up to this point, and I haven't brought myself to do it yet. But here is my public pledge to you. When I sit down tonight for the precious hour after my kids are quietly asleep and before I am, I will unravel the sweater. I will go back to the beginning. And I think that's why we come to church, honestly. This is a place that reminds us not just of who we are, but the best of who we could be. This is a place where, hard and heartbreaking though it is, we can say, we messed up, unravel, go back, and fix our mistakes again and again and again if we need to. Here we imagine a world where fixing what is broken is hard and heartbreaking and absolutely possible. I invite you to sing with me our opening hymn, Come and Go With Me. And now it's time for a story. This story was written by Polly Peterson, and it's the story of Ellen and William Craft, who you can see on your screens. They are abolitionists. And at the beginning of this story, they were an enslaved couple from Macon, Georgia, and they planned a daring escape from slavery. Ellen Craft had light skin and she could pass easily for white. She decided to disguise herself as an ailing Southern gentleman traveling to Philadelphia for medical care. Her husband, William Craft, whose skin was darker, would pretend to be her doting slave. Together, they would travel 1,000 miles to freedom in the North. On December 21st, 1848, they both obtained passes to travel to the next town for Christmas, but their real destination was in the North. They bought train tickets to Savannah, Georgia. From there, in their disguises, they traveled by train and steamboat up the coasts of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. By Christmas Day, they had arrived in Philadelphia, a northern city. After spending 3 weeks with a Quaker farmer and his family, The Crafts traveled to Boston, where they found a home. William worked as a cabinet maker and Ellen worked as a seamstress. They lived with Lewis Hayden, whose boarding house often served as a safe house for fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. The Crafts became members of Theodore Parker's Unitarian congregation, and they became outspoken abolitionists. In September 1850, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. The law not only provided for the return of fugitive enslaved people to their masters in the South, but also required private citizens in the North to assist in their capture. Abolitionists in Boston immediately began organizing resistance to the law. Theodore Parker was one of the founders of a vigilance committee designed to protect inhabitants of Boston from any invasion of their rights. The Vigilance Committee included Black people as well as white people. Lewis Hayden and William Craft were members. On October 20th, in 1850, 2 agents arrived in Boston, sent by the Crafts' former owners to catch them. The agents took for granted that Boston officials would assist them, but in this, they were very disappointed. Vigilance Committee members protected the Crafts and relentlessly harassed the 2 slave catchers. The coordinated actions of the abolitionist community and African Americans throughout the city thwarted the agents at every turn. They stayed in Boston for more than a month trying to waylay the Crafts, but in the end, they had to return to Georgia empty-handed. The Crafts were hurriedly rushed overseas to England, where they would be safe. And there they continued to work for abolition for the rest of their lives. And this is the end of our story. I invite you now into a time of sharing our joys and our sorrows with one another. This is a congregation, this is a community where we hold one another in our celebrations and in our pain. So whatever it is you hold on your heart this morning, know that we are with you. And I invite you to share the biggest feelings of your hearts, both joys and sorrows, in our chat now. Are there joys or sorrows to lift up this morning? There's lots we're sitting with today. We have joy at seeing grandparents after a long time apart. We have hope in our ancestors and in a good story. We are thinking of Laura as she struggles with schoolwork and of our migrant siblings with all that they're going through, including health struggles. We're grateful for springtime walks and anxious and concerned over COVID exposures. And we lift up joy for the life of Mary Purdy. For all these things and all those joys and sorrows left in the silence of our hearts, we are with one another. And I'd like to call us now into the spiritual practice of generosity. It is the generosity of each of you that funds the good work of this congregation. Together, we make possible what we dream of. And each month we share a quarter of our plate offering with a monthly service partner. You can give this morning online by visiting our website at canandaiguauu.org/connection/donate. Or you can give by mailing a check to the church at 3024 Cooley Road in Canandaigua. In each case, we ask that you note that this gift is meant as part of this morning's offering so that we can share a quarter of it with our service partner. And both of those ways of giving are listed in your chat now. Friends, it's May now, and we have a new service partner who I forgot to announce. Our service partner in May is the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, which is an organization administered through Soulfire Farm in Eastern New York State. And now I'd like to invite us into a time of centering, followed by shared silence. Let's get comfortable in our seats. Take a deep breath and let go of it with a sigh. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Feel supported by the chair, the floor, the good earth beneath you. Perhaps your eyes fall closed. And hear these words by Langston Hughes. I look at the world from awakening eyes in a black face, and this is what I see. This fenced off narrow space assigned to me. I look then at the silly walls through dark eyes in a dark face, and this is what I know, that all these walls oppression builds will have to go. I look at my own body with eyes no longer blind, and I see that my own hands can make the world that's in my mind. Then let us hurry, comrades, the road to find.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
I want to start this morning with a three-part reading. The first is from the 1790 Universalist Convention in Philadelphia. The Universalists there wrote, "We believe it is to be inconsistent with the union of the human race in a common Savior and the obligations to mutual and universal love, which flows from that union, to hold any part of our fellow creatures in bondage. We therefore recommend a total refraining from the African trade and adoption of prudent measures for the gradual abolition of slavery. in our country and for the instruction and education of children of all races in English literature and the principles of the gospel. Next is a reading from an essay signed by 173 Unitarian ministers in 1845. Took them a little bit longer. They wrote, "Our silence, therefore, is upholding slavery, and we must speak against it in order not to speak in its support. We contend for mental freedom. Shall we not denounce the system which fetters both mind and body? We have declared righteousness to be the essence of Christianity. Shall we not oppose the system which is the sum of all wrong? We claim for all people the right of brotherhood before a universal Father. Ought we not to testify against that which tramples so many of our brethren underfoot?" And finally, a word from Unitarian abolitionist Lydia Mariah Child. She wrote, "And so long as we take the necessity of slavery for an unalterable truth and put down any discussions, however mild and candid, which tend to show that it may be done away with safely, so long as we strengthen each other's hands in evil, what remote hope is there in emancipation?" And this is the end of our reading. I wanted to share the words of our Unitarian and Universalist abolitionist spiritual elders today because we need to talk about abolition. And first of all, maybe we need to talk about why we're still talking about abolition. Like, wasn't it finished 150 years ago? We still have, I believe, a lack of freedom in America. I think we can, all of us, agree we have a problem with policing and imprisonment in America. We think of policing as a fundamental part of our justice system, a cornerstone as old as law itself, but it's actually a fairly modern institution. Law enforcement at the beginnings of settler colonialism on this continent was mostly a community undertaking. Volunteer groups would sometimes ensure public safety, occasionally with public workers involved, depending on the municipality. None of it was formalized. Then in 1838, Boston's commercial shipping merchants successfully transferred the cost of securing their shipping wealth to the public. And we got the first organized public police force in the United States. Its purpose was not public safety, but the protection of private property. They claimed that protecting commercial capital was in the public interest. This is the model that was replicated shortly thereafter in the South in shifting slave patrols, militia groups that tracked and captured people escaping slavery, into publicly funded municipal police forces. They claimed that protecting commercial capital in the form of human beings was in the public interest. This is the foundation of policing in America. The framework for our modern day police is in service of two ends. One, the protection of private property, namely commercial capital. And two, the continuation of white supremacy culture by means of controlling Black people's bodies. I don't think we need a whole lot of elucidation on the ways this framework is still serving those ends. We have a problem with policing. And the problem is not a few bad apples acting with impunity. We can prosecute the bad apples, convict, imprison them in the same system they served to uphold, and we will not solve our problem with policing because the problem is in the framework itself. We don't have a few bad apples. We have an orchard planted in toxic soil. There is no tree noble enough to make that soil non-toxic again. Our abolitionist forebears and their allies and all the enslaved people who freed themselves were successful in ending chattel slavery in the 19th century. The 13th Amendment passed in 1865, and it says, Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And because of that little half sentence clause allowing for the enslavement and involuntary servitude of people convicted of crimes, we have seen the rate of state imprisonment, especially of Black Americans, skyrocket after Reconstruction. Chattel slavery is over, but the people in the United States are 5% of the world population, and we hold 25% of its prisoners. And who are those prisoners? Well, 97% of them never got a trial in our so-called justice system. They were sent to prison on a plea deal. And over 60% of prisoners are people of color, even though white people and people of color commit crimes at the same rates. In fact, 1 in 17 white men will spend time in jail in his lifetime, but 1 in 3 Black men will. None of those statistics even account for the extra legal prison camps we've built to detain immigrants and refugees seeking asylum at our borders. We have a problem with prisons. We can make prisons more comfortable, do away with the injustice of private enterprise capitalizing on the housing and feeding and provision of basic necessities for the people we imprison. And we will still have a problem with prisons. We use prisons as a tool in the work of white supremacy. We fill them with people who cannot afford to escape the reach of the justice system. We fill them with our Black and brown siblings because white supremacy culture has built a society that says their bodies do not belong to them. We pay slave wages to work in prison, making our clothing and fighting our wildfires and bottling New York State Health Department hand sanitizer because society says their labor does not belong to them. Their bodies do not belong to them. And in the work of upholding this lie, police kill 3 people a day in America. Those people are disproportionately Black. We have a problem with prisons. We have a problem with policing. Is the project of abolition completed? We passed the 13th Amendment. We pulled the diseased leaves off the plant, right? This is not one wilted head of lettuce in an otherwise lovely garden. We planted in toxic soil. It will never bear good fruit here. So I wish I didn't need to, but I'm here to tell you this morning that I'm an abolitionist. And I hope you will be too, because we still need abolition. Last summer, I had planted a beautiful garden in my tiny little city yard. For the first time, I planted a new to me species of winter squash, a Rochester native, and she was glorious. Vines flowing all over the place, big, fat, beautiful yellow flowers. And then one day, everything started to sag. I noticed the vines looking decrepit on my squash and on my nearby cucumbers. So I consulted the one person we all trust in a garden emergency, Petra Page Mann. She has dozens of tutorials for helpless souls like me. And with her aid, I realized I had squash vine borers. These creatures, these little bugs, bore into the squash vine, lay their eggs, and their larvae just destroy everything from the inside out. I wanted to figure out how to save the plants. What adjustments could I make? With all the sympathy and compassion a person could muster, Petra explained there would be no saving these plants. They had to be pulled up and destroyed. And there would be none of this squash, melon, cucumber I had chosen the next year either, because those pests were in the soil. The best I could do was find a new species of squash, one of the few resistant to the blight, and plant it in a year. Sometimes there isn't an easy fix. Sometimes we have to unravel it all to make things right again. Painful though it may be, moving forward with hope sometimes means having to admit that what we have in front of us is not repairable, and that we need to start anew. Plant in healthier soil. Choose a different plant altogether. Build a new framework when the old one is made out of our worst ideals. It doesn't feel practical. It's a huge undertaking. And you might hear the anti-abolition argument that police and prison abolition is impractical. Of course, our spiritual ancestors heard that about the abolition of chattel slavery as well, that it was naively utopian. I'd say, first of all, that using police to disperse houseless people instead of housing them is impractical. Arresting and imprisoning people with addiction instead of treating addiction is impractical. Protecting property from theft before we protect bodies from starvation is wildly impractical. Caring for human need before preserving a bad system is not impractical, but it is also not easy. It will not be easy. And we know the baby steps of so-called practical reforms. Reforms like early release programs, prison deprivatization, body cameras, bans on particularly dangerous restraints, access to less lethal weapons, and anti-bias training. None of these have had a measurable effect in curbing police brutality and the prison industrial system. Abolition is immensely practical if practicality accounts for all our needs. But it will cost us something. Progress requires generative imagination in a way that preserving the status quo does not. Almost always, doing the right thing requires more effort than doing the easy thing. Reforming the system we have is an impractical and immoral proposition because the system we have is white supremacy. The system we have is functioning exactly as it was designed. The police blueprint is slave patrollers, and modern prisons were always meant to punish and enslave. There is no reforming an evil system to be its best self. There is no moral ground anywhere between slavery and freedom. This is why I say I am an abolitionist. And better abolitionists than I have already begun imagining what abolition in practicality could look like. First of all, for us in our mostly white congregation of a mostly white denomination, it looks like less leadership and more followership. It looks like amplifying the voices of Black abolitionists and following their lead. They are working on this in our communities, calling us to join them already. We have, in the last 50 years, consistently slashed our social safety nets to bits and diverted funding from them to policing and military defense. Police are now expected to respond to the emergency needs of people facing mental health crisis, addiction, lack of housing, the trauma of poverty, and more. We call on police to respond to these non-criminal emergencies because we have eliminated all other avenues of care for them. We have done away with the safety nets that meet basic human needs to prevent harmful crime. We use police to address needs better met by social workers, healthcare workers, mental health professionals. And yes, those jobs have problems of their own with embedded white supremacy, but they have tools in their tool belts that aren't a gun. No amount of training will allow police to serve those purposes well because it is not what their role was designed for. And there are myriad models of community safety and accountability, restorative justice on a large scale that could keep communities safer for the people who live in them, especially people who are already marginalized and vulnerable, more effectively than our current model of police brutality. In some under-policed places, like extremely rural areas and affluent communities, these models of community-based safety and the priority of meeting needs over punitive enforcement of rules are already in place for us to learn from. I know it might feel scary and unsafe to consider the position of abolition. I would like us to sit with the fact that it especially feels unsafe to consider it from the perspective of someone who is served by the system of white supremacy. This is a framework that is meant to give us the sense of security without having to give us any actual security at all. Prisons and police enact the theater of security so that society does not have to build the conditions for actual safety and care, for meeting the needs of all people. This is why I say to you this morning, I am an abolitionist. Our proudest spiritual ancestors were called to be abolitionists, not plantation reformers. And they are calling us to be abolitionists still. I pray that I might be as morally courageous as Theodore Parker or Lydia Mariah Child, and that I might avoid the trap of capitulating to power and white supremacy like some of our other spiritual ancestors. At the very same time, those abolitionists were writing what we read earlier. Great Unitarian disappointment Millard Fillmore was signing the Fugitive Slave Act into law. Unitarian minister Theodore Clapp was writing to enslaved people that God had appointed for them their condition in life. Reverend Orville Dewey was espousing the benefits of a compromise on slavery for the unity of the nation. There are two ways we could go with this. And I have to pray that my own preaching and writing and work in the world will end up on the Parker and Child side of the historical ledger, that I will not allow power or security or comfort or promises of supremacy compromise in me the core moral tenet of our faith, that none of us is free until all of us are free. There are no compromises between slavery and freedom. There is no moral ground between free and not free. I pray that as we hear the words of our abolitionist elders, we might all be so bold. May it be so.
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Ooh, if I had a bell, I'd ring it in the morning, I'd ring it in the evening, all over this land. I'd ring out danger, I'd ring out warning, I'd ring out love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Ooh, if I had a song, I'd sing it in the morning, I'd sing it in the evening, all over this land. I'd sing out danger, I'd sing out warning, I'd sing out love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Ooh, well, I've got a hammer, and I've got a bell, and I've got a song to sing all over this land. It's a hammer of justice, it's the bell of freedom, it's the song about love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land.
I want to offer as a benediction these words from Nelson Mandela. It only seems impossible until it is done. Let us sing together our closing hymn, We Shall Overcome. Let's extinguish our chalices together. And as we do, we recite these words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thank you for being together this morning.